Emma, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Well, I appreciate it. So let's just jump right into it. Would you begin by introducing yourself and your company, and then perhaps sharing just a bit about why you care about sustainability?
My name is Emma Jones. I'm a senior manager of energy and sustainability at the RMR Group. We are a commercial real estate company. We've got all different kinds of buildings across the country, from commercial to industrial, multifamily, hotels, and senior living. My passion for sustainability and why I kind of got into this industry um, is I think we as people that occupy or own or, you know, lease space within buildings have a really big, not only I'd say opportunity, but responsibility to operate those buildings efficiently. I'm a sort of mechanical engineer by training, so efficiency is big for me. That's sort of what drives it. Waste and things not running optimally really bugs me. So trying to figure out where we can really drive those values home with tenants, not just in energy and water, but in recycling and green cleaning and things like that. That's a big passion for me.
One of the other things I appreciate about Emma is that she chairs the lead EB committee. So I have the pleasure of working with her, and she's been instrumental in helping improve version 5 and make some substantial improvements to it. So, again, thank you for spending a little bit of time with us today.
Mhm.
So, one of the things I'd like to ask you about is the concept of green leases. And understanding ISSA, it has something around 11,000 organizational members around the globe. And if you assume that many of the members have multiple buildings, it has a huge footprint. At the same time, the vast majority of members are small and medium-sized companies that don't own their own buildings, but rather are leasing space in another building. So that brings us to today's subject, which is green leases. So would you share a little bit about what is a green lease, how it impacts sustainability and sustainability reporting?
Sure. So my most of my familiarity with green leases comes from our certification with Green Lease Leaders, which is a program put out by the Institute for Market Transformation, or IMT. They have certain credits which kind of help walk both a landlord and a tenant through the process of creating a green lease. It gives you sample language. So that's sort of most of my foundation for green leases comes from that certification. And when we've gone through the certification for our different REITs within our company, the biggest pieces that we focus on are around transparency between the tenants and us. There are some buildings where the tenants are going to be managing the utilities, they're going to be managing their waste streams, and there's some buildings where we're going to be managing that. The ability to share that data between us as landlords to the tenants and tenants to landlords is really critical for a number of different reasons. But that's the majority of what we try to focus on is the ability to have transparency. Another piece that we focus on, or that's a big part of green leases, is overcoming what's called the split incentive barrier. So that's when maybe the person that's paying for an upgrade that will reduce utility expenses, like an energy efficiency upgrade, isn't the one that will see the financial benefit from that upgrade. So if the landlord pays for LED lighting, but the tenant pays for utilities, there's lease language that can help the landlord recover the cost of that project so that they do see some sort of financial benefit and the tenant sees the reduced utility expenses, and the landlord can, make sure their building is running efficiently.
So can a small company that's just leasing space in one of your buildings or in a building, Um, can they use a green lease? And if so, how do you recommend going about it? How does that small tenant go to the landlord? What should they do? How should they approach it? How do they make it work where they're initiating it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think, any tenant size, it doesn't really matter how much space in a building they occupy. They have a lease, and so they have a right to that space. They have a right to certain things. Um, I would recommend looking into uh, Green Lease Leaders has both a tenant and a landlord certification. You don't have to go through the certification, but you can look at the credits that are available. And if there's language that kind of resonates with that tenant's values, what they're looking for, if it's transparency, they want access to data. Maybe the landlord manages all the utilities, they just get billed back for them, but hey, they want to know how their building's performing, they want to know how their space is performing. That's something that they can write into the lease so that the landlord is required to give them access to utility data or access to benchmarking data, which the tenant might not already have access to. Um, Having those conversations, I don't think it needs to happen just during lease renewals or lease negotiations. I think having conversations with whoever your landlord contact is, whether it's the property manager or whoever, um, starting that conversation saying, hey, there's things, that we're interested in around data transparency or energy efficiency or green lease practices. Starting the conversation, I think, can happen outside of those more formal conversations with leases, because most likely the landlord has someone on their side that's managing, sustainability and is interested in this as well.
And as a landlord, from your perspective, so
Mhm.
we could really understand the needs and the issues that the people we're going to be negotiating or discussing with, what are you looking for? What are landlords looking to get out of the green leases?
I think we're looking for the biggest one is data. It's always about data. So for us, the way we use that data is probably most critically for benchmarking and building performance standards ordinances. So when we're required to submit that data to the city or state or county on behalf of our tenants, in some cases we just purchased a multifamily portfolio and hundreds of now individual resident accounts. That's tricky, and that's language that we've written into those leases so that we can have access to that data either through them or through the utility. But having access to data really empowers us to understand our building's performance, how it compares to our other buildings, where there's maybe a building that's a little bit behind the others or at risk of exposure to building performance standards. And the other, like I mentioned, is the ability to upgrade our buildings, even if we aren't the one paying utilities. There's some other credits within there that we've pursued around, you know, efficiency fit outs for tenants. So if a tenant is fitting out its own space, that we say you have to use, non-harmful materials or chemicals. You have to install certain efficiency equipment. You can't install, just anything. It has to be of a certain threshold. Usually Energy Star prescribes that. So that's what is most important for us.
What do you find or think are the biggest challenges to overcome or opportunities for improvement when it comes to setting up a green lease?
Yeah, I think from my perspective on the sustainability team at a corporate real estate company, the challenge is that we're not in the room when those lease negotiations are happening. What we've had to do, and usually I would say on the tenant side, the person that's maybe really passionate about sustainability is also not necessarily the person's in that room. So it's not necessarily the green lease focused people having those conversations during renewals or negotiations. But the way that we've kind of gotten around that is having standard lease language that, is baked into our standard lease. So when our leasing team is having those conversations, it's already there, it's already written out, it's talking about data transparency, it's talking about energy efficiency projects, and disclosure and things like that. So on our side, having a template ready, that took some work, but that makes it a lot smoother. On the tenant side, they can do the same thing. They can say, hey, when you go into this negotiation, this is the kind of language that we want incorporated, and then it's already written in. It's not sort of the burden isn't on those two people having those conversations to come up with what's important to them around green leasing.
So it sounds like if one of our members are interested in this, perhaps the first thing they need to do is to look at the Institute of Market Transformation's green lease language to be able to help sort of stimulate the conversation. And perhaps ISSA may be needs to sort of put some information together to help kickstart, to be a catalyst in making that happen?
Yeah, it's a really good re I don't work for them. I know I'm talking about them a lot, but it's a really good resource for these conversations. They have examples of lease language written to the credits. So if you're not really sure where to start, they can say, this is example lease language that can be used in this situation. It's a great resource, and there's a lot of good information in there to help kind of, yeah, stimulate those conversations and help facilitate them.
And in the end, you've often used the term transparency, as an organization's trying to do their own reporting, right? They need to have their utility data, right? Their electricity, their natural gas, their waste, all these things. And if they're not directly paying the bills, right? If the landlord's paying the bills, they somehow need to get access to that information so they can figure out what their footprint, what their impacts really look like. So hopefully this is a tool that they can use and will be needed to be used for them to be able to be successful at their own reporting.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the only challenge that comes from maybe a smaller tenant in a multi-tenanted building is when you're trying to understand your suite's energy usage, unless you're sub-metered, it can be kind of difficult. You can't just necessarily divide the energy usage by sort of proportional to your suite. Um, the most accurate way is to have sub-meters installed for energy and water. I'd recommend that anyway, just because access to that kind of granular data, both for the tenant and for the landlord, is really, really helpful. It's cost effective. It's not super expensive to do. But being, equipped with that kind of data and information just allows both the tenant and the landlord to work together a little bit easier.
Awesome. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share to help people get going, or anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I would say, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I would encourage those who have interests in this to not just have conversation, not to wait until their lease is up, have conversations with their landlords, ask to talk to a sustainability point person from the landlord side. We're on the landlord side always looking for that tenant sustainability point person. That's something that we're always chasing for is if we want to discuss, you know, a new initiative or a new project, who do we talk to on the tenant side to make sure that that's heard by the right people? Have those conversations, reach out, talk about what's important to you. It's possible that the landlord has the same priorities and you just don't realize it because you haven't, had those conversations yet. So I would say don't wait until those negotiations are happening. Just start the conversation.
Thank you so much for being with us today. You are greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.